Welcome to the South Bay Midweek Prayer and Bible Study. I know you're going to enjoy today's presentation. The live session is even better because we pray together at the beginning. Feel free to join us Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. You can find the link on our website. Now sit back and enjoy some spiritual refreshment.
I'll repeat some of what I shared last week as introduction. Somebody might be new here. What I'm sharing is some thoughts that aren't really new in the respect that they're in the book, The Great Controversy, and in other places. What I'm sharing more is a matter of emphasis that might be new and extrapolating from what we already know. I don't claim to be an expert in any of this field, and my hope would be that it just would stimulate some thought and more exploration, and maybe others can take it even further if there's any light in this. So with that little disclaimer, let me delve into this. A little review from last week. We started with the book Education that I had wrongly attributed to early writings. Somebody pointed that out. Thank you. Education, page 178. The history which the great I Am has marked out in his word, uniting link after link in the prophetic chain from eternity in the past to eternity in the future, tells us where we are in the procession of the ages and what may be expected in the time to come. So we call it the prophetic timeline. And some people go crazy with this, of course. They got all sorts of last day scenarios they're trying to depict. I don't want us to go there, but we do need to give credence to this whole concept that there's a prophetic timeline that God designed in the Word of God. Continuing, L. White says, all that prophecy has foretold is coming to pass until the present time has been traced upon the pages of history, and we may be assured that all which is yet to come will be fulfilled in its order. The striking thing about the prophetic timeline is it's designed so we can know where we are on the prophetic timeline so that we can rightly respond to what's taking place. And here's a typical prophetic timeline that we depict in our evangelistic meetings and our theological writings. Comes from Daniel mostly, and that's Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, and then papal Rome. So we bring it down to 1798. The next big event we talk about is from Daniel 8:14, 2,300 days fulfilled in 1844, the beginning of Jesus' heavenly sanctuary ministry in the most holy place. And then we typically jump down to Revelation 13. The United States makes an image to the beast. You get the latter rain, mark of the beast, the plagues in there, and then Jesus returns. Of course, these last three items, or 4 or 5 items I have here, we can't peg a date for them. The last date we have in Bible prophecy is the 2,300 days with 1844. But I want to zero in on this time period between 1798 and these future prophecies. So we have the timeline that I just mentioned, brings you down to 1798. But when we come to 1798, we need to ask, okay, what's the period? What is the entity, the ruling power of the world that's going to affect God's word, God's people, God's world, the word the most post 1798? We typically would say, well, it's the U.S. because the U.S. came up around this time. But when you look at Revelation 13, I'd like to invite you to delve into this, and I need to do this more myself. But the context in Revelation 13 is the U.S. when it makes an image to the beast, when it speaks as a dragon. Now, it came up during this time, but there's another power that came up during this time that has developed alongside the U.S. But the U.S. hasn't fulfilled fully its prophetic role until it makes an image to the beast and speaks as a dragon. So that's when it gets the spotlight on the world stage, prophetically speaking. So who has the spotlight now? You come to Revelation 11, there's what I call the missing beast of Bible prophecy. We don't talk about it much. It certainly doesn't make an appearance in our evangelistic meetings. I've never preached on this in an evangelistic meeting. I've worked with scores of evangelists. I've never heard an evangelist speak about this particular prophecy. And it's Revelation 11. It's the beast from the bottomless pit. And we'll take a moment just to read through this. And I'll give power to my two witnesses. They'll prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. So it's a beast. The beast represents a nation. Their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom in Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. So I don't intend to give a thorough exegesis of these texts. I just want to zero in on who is this beast from the bottomless pit that makes war against the two witnesses. So Ellen White does this for us in Great Controversy. She says, when they shall have finished or are finishing their testimony, the period when the two witnesses were to prophesy clothed in sackcloth ended in 1798. Two witnesses are the Old and New Testament. As they were approaching the termination of their work in obscurity, war was to be made upon them, war upon the Bible, by the power represented as the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. In many of the nations of Europe, the powers that ruled in church and state had for centuries been controlled by Satan through the medium of the papacy. But here's brought to view a new manifestation of satanic power. So this power makes war on the Bible, and it's a new manifestation of satanic power. We'll come back to that. The great city in whose streets the witnesses are slain and where their dead bodies lie is spiritually Egypt. Of all nations presented in Bible history, Egypt was most boldly denied the existence of the living God and resisted his commands. No monarch ever ventured upon more open and high-handed rebellion against the authority of heaven than did the king of Egypt. Reading on, she identifies this as atheism. This is atheism. And the nation represented by Egypt would give voice to a similar denial of the claims of the living God and would manifest a like spirit of unbelief and defiance. The great cities also compared spiritually to Sodom. The corruption of Sodom and breaking the law of God was especially manifested in licentiousness. And this sin was also to be a preeminent characteristic of the nation that should fulfill the specifications of this scripture. According to the words of the prophet, then, a little before the year 1798, some power of satanic origin and character would rise to make war upon the Bible. And in the land where the testimony of God's two witnesses should thus be silenced, there should be manifest the atheism of the Pharaoh and the licentiousness of Sodom. This prophecy has received a most exact and striking fulfillment in the history of France. During the revolution in 1793, the world for the first time heard an assembly of men born and educated in civilization and assuming the right to govern one of the finest of the European nations uplift their united voice to deny the most solemn truth which man's soul receives and renounce unanimously the belief and worship of a deity. France presented also the characteristics which especially distinguished Sodom. During the revolution, there was manifest a state of moral debasement and corruption, similar to that which brought destruction upon the cities of the plain. And the historian presents together the atheism and the licentiousness of France as given in the prophecy. Intimately connected with these laws affecting religion was that which reduced the union of marriage, the most sacred engagement which human beings can form. And the permanence, notice this, the permanence of which leads most strongly to the consolidation of society, to the state of a mere civil contract of a transitory character, which any two persons might engage in and cast loose at pleasure. If fiends had set themselves to work to discover a mode of most effectually destroying whatever is venerable, graceful, or permanent in domestic life, and of obtaining at the same time an assurance that the mischief which it was their object to create should be perpetuated from one generation to another, they could not have invented a more effectual plan than the degradation of marriage. Sophie Arnaud, an actress famous for the witty things she said, described the Republican marriage as the sacrament of adultery. So Republican marriage is referring to the revolutionaries. So notice a couple of things here about this. It's France. It arises a little before 1798, makes war on the Bible. It's a new manifestation of satanic power. So it's different from the manifestations of Satan with the union of church and state. It has atheism, licentiousness, and another interesting feature here is it's the degradation of marriage into a transitory civil contract that has a multi-generational negative impact. It's the breakdown of Judeo-Christian values that underpin Western civilization. So, a lot of the problems we have today in our society is because the breakdown of the family. And this goes back to the licentiousness, the atheism of the French Revolution that has been perpetuated throughout time. So a lot of interesting things here. And as you look at this point number 3, a new manifestation of satanic power, I find it interesting. Satan is the master strategist, right? So he had worked the strategy of uniting church and state for centuries. And now he's shifting his plan. And I want to raise the question for you to consider: did he shift it there in the French Revolution, realizing that what he was starting in the French Revolution would also have hundreds of years of impact that was going to grow into something much bigger and global than just what was there in the French Revolution? And I believe the answer to that is yes. It was all part of his plan, and I'll try to demonstrate that here tonight. So what we're going to do tonight is a whole lot of history. If you don't like history, you'll just say that guy did a whole lot of talking. But I hope that you'll see some of the relevance of this. So let me take you into the French Revolution a bit, and then I'm going to make some comparisons to today, not too many, but if you're up with what's going on, you'll make the linkage. So just a basic timeline: the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799 is the French Revolution. And a lot happened in that period of time. And I'm going to give you a big overview of what happened in that time. And then that transition into the Napoleonic era, Napoleon Bonaparte. That's very significant, 1799 to 1804. And I'll show you how the French Revolution was a catalyst that set society up for the tyranny of Napoleon, and that he was worse in many ways than what they had in the king. There were some benefits that came out of the French Revolution, but as far as a monarch, an emperor ruling their lives, Napoleon had significant control over their lives. So here's a breakdown of the timeline. What caused the French Revolution? The book Great Controversy says things in a very nice, succinct way, but when you dig into it, a lot was going on. So leading up to the revolution, France was bankrupt from a lot of wars and things that were taking place. The economy was in trouble. There were 20 years of poor harvest, drought, cattle disease, inflation. If you read anything on the French Revolution, bread prices was a key thing. There were high taxes imposed by the church and the nobility, and it was the working class people that bore the brunt of this. Mostly all the others were exempt from these taxes. This led to rioting, looting, and striking. And so there were what they called the three estates. The clergy was the first estate, the nobility were the second, and the common people were the third estate. So when you study that era, you'll hear these three estates mentioned over and over again. So in the context of this rioting, looting, and this protesting about bread prices, King Louis XVI calls for the Estates Generals, the first that's been called since 1614, and it's written in their ruling documents that they can call this. So it's an assembly of the three estates together. Calls it for May 5, 1789. They get together, and the third estate comes with the goal to demand fairer representation and a vote by representation and not by status. So they actually outnumbered the other two estates, but their vote was less counted, less influential. So they came with a desire to reform things. So by June, a month later, the third estate says, we're out of here. They all move and they go over to a place that is a tennis court where they meet, an indoor tennis court. And they formed their own national assembly and they demand a constitutional reform. Some of the clerics, 47 liberal nobles, joined them, and that forces the king to accept the runaway National Assembly in place of the Estates General. So they use these bullying tactics to force the government to shift over towards them. Interestingly, this is the origins of the liberal left and the conservative right, because when they met, the liberal people that wanted a change, they all sat on the left together. And the people that were in favor of the monarchy and keeping status quo, they all sat on the right. And that's why we talk about the liberal left and the conservative right to this day. It comes out of the French Revolution. Things escalate. They storm the Bastille, July 14, 1780. That was a prison fortress. It's where they kept the gunpowder and weapons. That's the official historical start of the revolution. Things happen. They write a new constitution in 1791. There are wars that take place because there are people that have fled France and they want to now come back in and restore the monarchy. They arrest the king. There's insurrection. They kill the counter-revolutionaries. They're trying to bring the government back into line. And the king is condemned to death. Marie Antoinette, she's put to death 9 months later. And then you got these people, the Jacobins, they take control of the National Convention from the moderate Girondins, and they passed radical legislation, including changing the calendar. This is where this takes place. Changing the calendar, abolishing religious holidays and Christianity. And this begins the Reign of Terror. It's a 10-month period. So the whole revolution wasn't a reign of terror. It's a 10-month period within the revolutionary period. And this is where they guillotine anybody that they sense is opposed to the revolution. Robespierre is the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. That's the council that's condemning people to death. Eventually that flips on him and he gets condemned to death and he loses his head in the same way that he was condemning others. There's the Thermidorian reaction. This is to make things moderate. And then you have the National Convention approves a new constitution. Still, the conservatives who are royalists and the liberals, the Jacobins oppose this, but the military silences them. The government's now led by a 5-member directory. They have all sorts of problems. And then here's what happens. The whole country's just in chaos. And the reason I gave you that history was to show you it wasn't just 1 or 2 events. There was a lot of drama, play and counterplay happening. A lot of wars taking place, lots of insurrection, lots of resistance to what was happening to the revolution. And all this was taking place, and people were fulfilling prophecy and did not even know they were fulfilling prophecy. And they were being set up for something bigger, and it was setting the world up for something bigger, and they had no idea what's happening. So now in the midst of all this chaos, people are wanting some homeostasis. They want things to return to some sort of normal. So Napoleon now, who's been making a name for himself as a general fighting in behalf of the revolution down in Italy and Egypt, he comes back to France in the summer of 1799, and he comes back to a hero's welcome. And he eventually overthrows the French Directory. That's the leadership of the country. And they make him the first consul. And now you have the Napoleonic era. Now he crowns himself in 1804 as the Emperor of France. So what they did is now they accepted the tyranny of a dictator in order to help them get some sort of normality back into their lives. So the chaos of revolutions sets you up for dictatorship. And that's an important thing to realize. And you'll see that in all revolutions is what happens. So a couple of lessons from the French Revolution. A few takeaways to consider. There's much more than this. Change takes many steps. You know, when I first was introduced to French Revolution, it was by reading The Great Controversy. It's a nice chapter. It's a fairly good sized chapter, and it just nicely packages it. But those people that were living through it were going through a lot of stuff and didn't realize it. I posed the question, could we be in our own transitory time, transitional phase right now, with the revolution that's taking place? And make no mistake, there's a revolution taking place in America. Could we be in the midst of something very similar and not realize it? These steps can be chaotic. They can take time. And a person living through the change may not understand where they are in the transitional process from the old order to the new order. So they're hopeful it's not going to be as bad. When King Louis XVI said, okay, we won't do the Estates General, we'll go meet with you over there in this new national convention, that he signed his death warrant right there when he gave in like that, and he was never able to turn it back. Revolutions are about who will wield the power. Revolutions dehumanize those who are perceived to be in power so that they can be eliminated and make way for the new power structure. And since the French Revolution, revolutions have always been about the have-nots, whether perceived or real, taking power from the perceived haves. You see this happening today. Again, I'll just kind of throw that out there. What we have is a revolution taking place where we're demonizing one particular group of people because of the color of their skin. And that is all about taking power away from people who are perceived to have the power in order to make way for a revolutionary group to take power. The chaos of the revolution prepared the way for Napoleon to become an absolute ruler who actually ended up removing some of the very freedoms gained during the revolution. He conscripted people into the army. He fought useless wars that he lost. He bankrupted France, and he ultimately was a disaster. But he was a popular leader in the beginning. He rode in on this populist desire for him to rescue them from all the problems that they were in. Now, look at this from The Great Controversy, and I cite the pages there. She says, at the opening of the revolution, by concession of the king, the people were granted a representation exceeding that of the nobles and the clergy combined. We mentioned that. Thus, the balance of power was in their hands, in the common people's hands, but they were not prepared to use it with wisdom and moderation. Eager to redress the wrongs they'd suffered, they determined to undertake the reconstruction of society. Later, you see, I highlight, they were an excited and maddened people. So there are people that want power. And you see this in Zimbabwe. They want to overthrow the white farmers and everything. So they did. Before that, they ate plenty of food. They were not an impoverished country. But when they overthrew the perceived people in power, the people that took over, they took over all the land from the white farmers. They went into starvation. They did not know how to wield their power now that they had. And so they were now starving, and they needed to import food, even though before they had plenty of food. All this was as Satan would have it. This was what for ages he had been working to secure, his strategy. His policy is deception from first to last. So he set this whole French Revolution up as a new way to attack God, distinctly different from what he had been doing with the papacy. In the last sentence here that I highlighted. In like manner, when those who've been degraded and brutalized through his cruel power achieve their freedom, he urges them on to excesses and atrocities. So there's no question that these people had been used. The common people, they were overly taxed, they were kept poor, they were kept ignorant, and there needed to be reforms. But they overshot the mark because they were not personally prepared to handle the power that they were getting. So they overshoot the mark. They're not wise. And now their solution is worse. Their cure is worse than the disease in many respects. And I wonder if that's not where we're headed today. So she says, then this picture of unbridled license, these excesses that they do, is pointed out by tyrants and oppressors as an illustration of the results of liberty. So in other words, you see what happened? They got liberty, and now look what they've created. They've created all this chaos. Therefore, we need to restrict liberty, and we need a dictatorship. So it's the pendulum swing. And I believe that is the model actually for the future, is the pendulum swing that we're going to have. So let me, in my remaining moments, race through a number of slides here. So I believe the French Revolution is still influential today. And if you study history and historians, that's not an original thought with me. So look at some of the things that were happening. 1789, 1799 is the French Revolution. You have the Enlightenment philosophers, Rousseau, Voltaire. They were pantheistic and anti-Catholic, also known as anti-Christian. Their views undergird the French revolutionary leaders such as Robespierre. Karl Marx, who you know is the founder of Marxism, communism, he was a German philosopher. He moved to Paris October 1843. Paris at that time was home to many European revolutionaries who were fomenting revolution in their home countries from the home of the French Revolution. So Paris, because of the French Revolution, became this magnet for these revolutionaries. And the 1800s was full of revolutions across Europe. Marx studies the French philosophers, the French Revolution. He studies Proudhon, who's the first self-described anarchist. And we have a lot of anarchy and proud anarchists today in our country. It all goes back to Proudhon. In 1844, Marx authors the Economic Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. He meets Engels in 1844. They published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. In 1848, revolutions are breaking out across Europe. 50 countries are affected. In 1859, Marx publishes a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. It's the same year Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species. Speaking of Darwin, meanwhile, he sails on the Beagle in his scientific research, 1831 to 36. 1838, he conceives his theory of natural selection. In 1844, he publishes anonymously a bestseller, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, where he introduces a concept called transmutation of species. It's the predecessor of natural selection. And then in 1859, he publishes On the Origin of Species, which is a natural ally to Marxism. And Darwin and Marx were intimately aware of each other's works and how they supplemented each other's views. And I'm not going to take the time of it, but we have letters where Engels writes Marx and he says, look at there. You know, here's Darwin, if you read there in the first paragraph. The Darwin, which I'm just reading, is really stupendous. And he says, this synchronizes with your theory. And so you've got this relationship. And Darwin wrote Marx himself and thanked him for Marx sending him his book on Des Capitals, or capital, we pronounce it in English. On the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birthday, which was 2018, there was a lot of celebration about Karl Marx. In a USA Today article, James Bovard said, "Don't celebrate Karl Marx. He was responsible for the killing of hundreds of millions of people through Marxism." But what I want you to see here is he quotes philosophy professor Jason Barker declared that educated liberal opinion is today more or less unanimous in its agreement with Marx's basic theses on the flaws of capitalism. So remember the anti-Wall Street movement not too long ago, the riots and the stuff that you're seeing happening last year. There is a definite Marxist connection to all that revolution that's taken place. The leaders of it espouse Marxism. Marx is a new hero today. And it's a very interesting thing. I won't take the time, but here's an article from a Baptist resource. It says Marx is cool again. He's cool again. In fact, on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birthday, the Chinese paid for an 18-foot tall bronze statue of Marx to be erected in Germany. And you know, it's pretty phenomenal. We're tearing down some statues, and then people are putting up statues to Marx. The British Humanist Association, which is a humanist, you know, they're promoting humanism. They point out that they go back to Karl Marx, and all of this is an attack on Christianity. So these are some of the things that have been taking place. Now, let me wind up with just these thoughts. So you have Lenin, Bolshevik Revolution. He's the heir to political Marxism in Russia. Mao Zedong is the Chinese heir to Marxism, father of communist China. Prior to World War II, there was a group of dissident Marxists. Marx was German, remember. They formed what's called the Frankfurt School. You can Google this. Very interesting history. One of the founders was Max Horkheimer. Along with others, he fled Nazi Germany, eventually came to the US, where they relocated the Frankfurt School at Columbia University in New York City. And there they taught and promoted their brand of Marxism. They're the ones who came up with what they call critical theory. Critical theory is the basis for all the different types of critical theories, including critical race theory, which you've heard a lot of in the last year, which is being taught to our military, which is the basis for a lot of stuff that's being urged in society today, is critical race theory. It directly relates back to Marxism through the Frankfurt School. So my main thesis is this, is that the French Revolution has a far greater influence than just that period in the late 18th century, that it is that power that has permeated all your different structures of society and nationalities, nations. So it's politics, it's journalism, it's media. Marxism is there everywhere through the French Revolution. And it's what's interesting is that the young people are proudly Marxists. They don't realize how dangerous Marxism is. And so they're proudly Marxists. And they're the ones driving to try to change our governments today. So here's something to think about. What if they succeed? What if prophecy is actually saying they will succeed? And then could it be that the US, when it makes an image of the beast, is actually a reaction? It's the Napoleonic parallel to what is happening today. So just some thoughts to consider. As I said, I don't have all the answers for that, but it's some things to consider, as well as some things that we'll look at in the future, look more closely at Revelation 11 and 13, and see how these two beasts relate to one another.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found today's presentation to be a blessing to you. And you know, it's never good to keep things to yourself. It's always best to share them. So find someone that you can share what you have been blessed with others. If you enjoyed today's presentation, let us know by hitting the like button, and subscribe to this channel if you want to know when there's new presentations coming out. God bless. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.